All right, Drew, thanks for jumping on last minute. This is episode 30 for me. This should come out in about mid to late November. So I'm going to hand it off to you for you to give everybody your elevator pitch.
Now, help me out. What is an elevator pitch? That might just be American vernacular.
Give us your 30-second intro, kind of what you do, what kind of got you interested into podcasting.
Just Drew Missing from Your Missing the Point podcast. I initially started off listening to podcasts during COVID. Initially, it was OBDM, Our Big Dumb Mouth. Then it was Union of the Unwanted and a couple of those other shows. Legit Bat, those types of ones. It was just a bit of a means of escape during the near 3.5 years of lockdown in Victoria. So eventually that manifested into me reaching out to a couple of the podcasters that I listen to, letting them know I like their work, and guest appearing on Deborah Gets Red Pilled with Adam, Chud, and Deborah. So kind of started off there. I thought, I can do this, and kind of just started my own show and my means of getting my voice out there and talking a bit. And it's almost like it's a bit of a mental relief just to speak to people who are like-minded or open to different things that don't necessarily follow the mainstream.
I agree. I joke. I say it's cheap therapy.
Definitely.
But okay. Well, I know we had kind of gone back and forth a couple of weeks ago on what we were going to talk about, and it seemed like the easiest thing for us would be some hunting and fishing. So I'm from Tennessee, right? Things are totally different in my part of the world on hunting. Could you just kind of give me a brief overview on how all that works in your part of the world?
Well, all the deer species in Australia are introduced, so we don't have any native deer in Australia. We're not allowed to, as white fellas, hunt any of our native species. So that's kind of off the cards. Only Indigenous people are allowed to do that. So it's literally just introduced species like rabbit, deer, foxes, quail, some native quail, some non-native quail. The only native species we can hunt in Australia tend to be our birds and our waterfowl and just land-based birds like quail and all that type of thing. But generally, for the most part, it's our introduced species, so we don't really have any hunting seasons like that. We can shoot them any time of the year we want. Anytime we want to stock the freezer full of some venison, that's when we can do it. There's no tag systems in Australia at all because they're an endemic introduced species. It's kind of a free-for-all, really. So much to the point that our state governments actively send out chopper crews in helicopters with AR-15s, and they shoot as many as they can in the high country and then just leave them there, which is a damn shame.
Okay, yeah, I knew they'd done some stuff like that with maybe goats in New Zealand at one point. That's I mean, I think that's kind of cool, but that's kind of the Texas thing, right? To go hunt out of a helicopter. But you said it's a bunch of deer species, right? Is it Eurasian deer? Or am I just making that up?
Yeah, it's a mix of Eurasian and European. So the main introduced species of the larger deer are our red deer, which there's a mix of Wapiti cross in there as well. So you've got that along Queensland into New South Wales into northern Victoria. We've then got the Asiatic deer, which is a Samba, which is similar size to a red deer, big dark brown guys. They're from swamplands in Indonesia, India, and the like. They've actually adapted really well to the Victorian bushland. It's almost like they're meant to be here. We've then got fallow deer, so they're from Europe, smaller deer again. Then hog deer, which is another Asiatic swamp deer, which is about the size of a sheep. Really good eating, very hard to get a hold of in Australia. We've got Rusa, which is similar to a Samba, and Sika. There's a bunch of mostly Asiatic, and then there's a few little European deer we've got here as well.
Okay, so do you hunt pretty regularly, or is it just something you kind of do when you get a chance? And did you grow up hunting, or is it just something you kind of fell into?
I grew up hunting. My dad's a hunter. I'm in regional Victoria, so our area is considered Samba country, so nearly every man and their dog, they go out hunting. Dad started off in hound crews, so running out with dogs that would run the Samba down, and then they'd push them up on the hunter and they'd shoot the deer. He moved out of that into stalking. That's when I kind of got into hunting with Dad. It was just a means of tracking, going through the sign, looking through the bush, finding rubbings, wallows, and then going out and finding The deer, it's a bit more of sorry, cat scratching in the background. It's a bit more of a challenge than what hound hunting is. It's sitting up on a gully, glassing the area with the scope and waiting for things. It's probably the closest thing in Australia you'd get to what blind hunting would be, but you don't necessarily stay in any one spot. You're constantly moving, trying to push the deer out and find them as you can.
Okay, yeah, I know. What you're describing is more like hunting out west. The western, part of the U.S., Montana. Where you're walking around and looking for sign. And do you do any backpacking while you're doing that? I mean,
that's generally what it is. It's we call it stalking here. So generally, for the most part, you'd spend a day or two backpacking into any kind of mountainous high country area. You'd set up a camp, and then you put your day pack on, and you'd go out and you'd scout an area out, and then you come back each day. That's the main part of stalking that we do here. Generally, It's a 3 or 4 day type of event.
Okay. So are there any sort of strange regulations on what you guys can and can't hunt with? I know I told you I enjoy handgun hunting. I'm sure that's probably kind of foreign to y'all over there.
Very foreign, very foreign. So we have caliber variation rules on what we can hunt. So depending on the size of the deer dictates what caliber of rifle you can use. So for the larger deer, so your red deer, wapiti cross, your sambar, your rusa, those types of deers, it's the 308, 3006, that type of a caliber range. Your big mule kicking calibers. And then you get down to your smaller deer, like your fallow deer, your hog deer and alike. You're actually able to use 6.5 Creedmoors and smaller calibers like that. So it really just depends on what you're going after. You can use 12 gauge with slugs on deer in Australia as well, but that tends to be more of an American thing. I wanted to try that out with hog deer here, but just the size of the deer and the slug, it's just going to do too much damage. But it tends to be those larger caliber rifles.
Okay. I'm assuming getting firearms there is kind of a pain. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, or is it just me being American thinking it's probably harder than it needs to be?
It's probably very hard in comparison to what Americans are used to. I can remember being in the States and going into a Walmart and seeing a sign that said a limit of 5 rifles and 5 pistols per customer per day. And I thought, fuck, this is heaven. But in Australia, in comparison, so you go through to the police station, you sit the course, you get your shooter's license, then you have your junior permit, and then you can get into your adult permit after that, which I did as a kid, and then got my adult shooter's license. After that, when you go to buy your first rifle, there's like a 3-month like cooling off period where they do background checks and everything like that. So it takes a while to get your first gun. And then after that, it's not as long a process. Usually your firearm register or your gun store you're buying from, they can process it in about a week, 2 weeks, depending on what you're getting. But yeah, just the usual shit that it's associated with governments and control. They want to know what you're buying, where you're storing it, how you're storing it. There's license variations in Australia. So there's, depending on what category of license you have, it dictates what type of firearms you can have. I have a category A and B, which is long arms, shotguns, and air rifles. After that's a category C, where you can have semi-automatics, which is generally reserved for people in the military, police, and farmers, ironically, can have those as well.
Okay. I guess the only thing I would say would be anything comparable would, we have hunter's education, which you've got to have to hunt by yourself. And then would be buying NFA items, machine guns, short barrel rifles, and silencers. That's about the only, thing that hems you up. I actually joke, I'm in so many systems as it is. I'm like, I don't even know why we're doing the background check. Like, they click the button and it comes back. So, do y'all have archery hunting over there? Is that something that's popular?
We do. It's been getting bigger in the last couple of decades. So the last 10, 15 years or so. It's had a little bit of a cult following, and it's picked up over time, especially the likes of Joe Rogan and stuff becoming popular. There's a lot of guys up north in Queensland which go bow hunting on the red deer. It's interesting, but it's not something I think I would ever get into. I tend to like the stalking and and the backpacking in and out of country and doing it that way. It's growing, but nowhere near the level of what firearms are.
Okay. Last thing, and then I'll move on to some fishing. And I do have a hog hunting question, but is there any sort of history of like sport shooting? I used to shoot a lot of trap and skeet, and I believe I shot with some people from Australia back in the day.
Clay shooting's really big here. In my high school years, I was in my school's clay shooting group. So little regional country government school. We went out into Melbourne. We competed against all the private schools, and they had their perfectly fine-tuned shotguns that are German-made and pristine and have the embroidery and everything on the stock. And then there was us country boys in there with our shotguns that we use on rabbits each weekend. And we went toe-to-toe with them in clay shooting. But it is big here. A lot of the gold medals we get as a country in the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics tend to be in those fields, in clay shooting and target shooting.
Okay. Are y'all still connected with the UK? You said the Commonwealth Games, or is that just something that's carried over?
Yeah, we're still part of the Commonwealth. So our head of state is still the king. It used to be the Queen, is now the king. So Commonwealth Games is something we always participate in. We were actually supposed to host the 2026 Commonwealth Games, but our state premier cancelled it at the last minute. So it's caused a bit of a shit show across the Commonwealth now, with Canada also knocking it back. So I don't know how long the empire has left in its current form.
I gotcha. So hog hunting, right? That's one thing I find really interesting. I've been on one hog hunt in my life, but I've watched a lot of YouTube videos of guys in Australia hog hunting, either, being on four-wheelers or kayaks and hunting that way. Is that something you have any familiarity with?
In my region, we don't have too many wild populations of pigs. That tends to be a Western Australian, Queensland, New South Wales, Northern Territory type of a deal, where the numbers just exploded where they are. Also goats around here. So a lot of people had pet goats and they've kind of got out into the bush and then kind of bred out in numbers. Hog hunting is really interesting here. A lot of guys run their dogs, so they've got like just mongrel mixes of dogs, pit bulls, all sorts of things thrown into them, and they armor them up with their leather armor, and they just set the dogs out on the pigs, so because they need the armor, because the tusks, the pigs will tear the dogs up. But a lot of guys, they'll have their firearms, but a lot of the young guys who are a bit wild, they'll send the dogs out, they'll let the dogs pin down the pig, and then they'll knife it, and that's how they'll kill the boar. They'll let the dogs pin it down, and then they'll just finish it with a knife.
Yeah, that's the only way I've been hog hunting. It's different. To me, that was about the most exciting hunt I've had. But that's also kind of a southern U.S. thing. Actually, a lot of people here view hunting with dogs like that as kind of like the white trash, redneck thing to do.
Yeah, we tend to think of it as Southerners in Australia. We tend to think that's a northern bogan thing to do. We're a bit more refined and we just use our firearms.
I gotcha. Well, what about fishing? That is something I don't have the patience to do. I used to joke. I could say, I can sit outside all day in the heat and shoot 300 targets and then go to a shoot off. But God forbid you give me a fishing rod and stick me in a boat. I just can't do it. So, y'all, how does that work over there? Is it mainly rivers or offshore or?
Mix of everything. Naturally, being an island continent, fishing and recreation is huge in Australia. Yet again, there are regulations out the wazoo for all of this. You need a fishing license in Victoria and most states across Australia. There are bag limits on what fish you can get and what sizes you can take. But there's a whole mix of things. There's fly fishing, which is inland and across our rivers and streams in Victoria for rainbow trout, brown trout, that type of thing. And then you go offshore where you've got surf fishing, where people tend to have their really big, long surf rods and they'll stay on the shore and they'll cast out over the sandbars and go fishing that way. And then there's just off boat, which is predominantly what I've done a lot of my lifetime. My dad's always had boats and we go out to the beach house over a weekend and go out for a fish and have a good time. It's massively huge in Australia, and it's really disappointing that we're going down that green agenda of the environment's being a focus, which is great. Like, we want to protect our fisheries and make sure there's enough for everyone, but it seems to be that their answer to it all is just banning things left, right, and center. And I wouldn't give it too much longer if fishing is that heavily regulated here that there's no point in actually going out anymore.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a problem in your part of the world, but from what I understand, the Chinese are pretty bad about coming, close to international waters and just overfishing everything. Go ahead.
Sorry, we're lucky that we're that far south. If the Chinese made it this far down to us, I think the Navy should have picked them up before now. More so Queensland, top of Western Australia, that type of area near Indonesia. We get a lot of Indonesian fishermen that go through and trawl and catch all the fish in our top ends. But luckily, the majority of fish down here, they're in the reserves where there should be enough for everyone. But then again, you've got the local cowboys that go out there netting and they'll just decimate areas and do the wrong thing by everyone and just overcatch. And then we have to wait for the populations to come back.
Yeah, I've always joked. I think fishing is just a good excuse to drink beer. That's all it's ever been, at least for me, So do you do any fly fishing? That seems something that's really relaxing. I don't know if it is, but I went out west last year and I just saw tons of people doing it.
Yeah, I've got a few mates who got into it and they tried to get me on board, and I found it just inherently frustrating, whether it was I couldn't get the technique down or couldn't figure out the flies. I couldn't get it. It just didn't sit well with me. It's not the usual cast, drop the line, let it go out a bit, and then flick over the spindle. But it's big here for the types of rivers we've got in Victoria. It's Victoria and Tasmania are probably the closest you'd get to what Europe would be in fly fishing. We've got a lot of good little streams and estuaries, so it is big, but I'm not a fan of it. Like you said, it's a bit too slow for me. It seems to be a gentlemanly pursuit. A lot of people put it down to, but I prefer to just fish in lakes and streams, going for Australian game fish like the Australian bass, the Murray cod, which are massive. They can get like 1.5 meters long. They're huge, absolute beasts, and catfish and things like that. But yeah, the flies tend to be more of those introduced species more than anything else.
Okay. Now with the hunting and fishing you do, I'm assuming you eat most everything that you, I guess, harvest?
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing that we kind of have to be cautious of in Australia is our government released a virus into the wild rabbit populations to try and kill them off. So Mixo and a couple of other viruses, man-made viruses, were put into the population. So generally, you have to be careful where you're harvesting rabbit from. There seems to be a bit of a tell where as soon as you skin them and you take out all the organs, if the liver has black spots or the lungs have black spots on it, it tends to be a bit of a sign that they've actually caught one of those diseases. So you kind of steer clear of it.
Wow, that's crazy. I know they've talked about doing stuff like that with hogs in Texas, but that's I guess there's not really many native species, right, that are as destructive as a lot of the things that have been introduced.
Well, that seems to be a bit of the misconsensus, and a lot of the greenies tend to think the argument, especially around deer, is that deer in the high country, they trample and they destroy the native grasses and they rub the trees, and they're invasive species. But if you look what a wombat does on the average, the wombat digs up so many holes, eats the root systems and are like around trees to the point where they collapse. Some of our most destructive species are actually native. So if anything, a couple of these introduced species really aren't doing all too much. If anything, the deer here are a good thing because they eat all the low growing green growth and prevent forest fires. So bushfires, that'd be better than having them killed off, I think.
What about kangaroos? Is that something y'all can hunt? I've heard stories of people back in the day having like driven kangaroo hunts. I hear they're kind of a nuisance at times. Is that true?
So at one point we were allowed to shoot kangaroos. It was perfectly fine. My dad grew up in a family of 9. His father was a World War II POW, very psychologically damaged and physically damaged man. So he had a lot of alcohol problems and whatnot. They grew up very poor, not having a lot to eat. So my dad's family was literally fed on kangaroo soup, kangaroo tail soup, rabbits, whatever they could get a hold of. That's what they ate. So kangaroo was a big staple of the Australian diet for westernized Australians for a long time until we brought in the acts where only Indigenous people can hunt them. You'll find that they'll do a cull every now and again. That the numbers of kangaroos have exploded to the point where they have to go out and shoot a few thousand of them at any given time. That's mostly due to a lot of Victoria was covered in red gum forest and a lot of old growth forest. And as the farmers came in, colonization, they clear-felled areas for farming, and that naturally gave lots of open land for grass, which the kangaroos eat. So naturally their populations exploded with the access to more food.
I got you. So is it the Aborigine that are y'all's Indigenous people?
Yeah, so there's the Aboriginals, and then there's a bit of a contentious issue where there was actually possibly a native people here prior to the Indigenous people, which are a pygmy race of people in North Queensland, which are referred to as the Negro Grotti, which were a smaller pygmy people, which supposedly looked a bit more African in appearance to what our mainland Aboriginal Australians are.
Okay, so the Aborigine, what can they hunt? I mean, you said that there are certain native species that you can't hunt. What would a few of them be? I know you just said the kangaroo's one.
Yeah, so for the most part, they can go after pretty much everything, unless there's a critically endangered species. Generally, they can go after anything. So we've got our Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, which are the islands above Australia. Wombats, kangaroos, possums, wallabies, which is like a smaller version of a kangaroo, emus, goannas, snakes, whatever they want, really, they can go after. Even dugongs, so like the southern hemisphere version of the manatee. I've seen a couple of young guys up north which will just jump over the side of a boat and stick a manatee and cut it in half in the water and then put it up on a canoe. Yeah, it's really quite messed up how there's rules for thee and not for me. How certain people can hunt certain things, but we can't.
Yeah, you're really highlighting the whole being a second-class citizen. So do they get government assistance and all kinds of stuff like maybe some of the Native Americans in the U.S. do? I mean, do they have like reservations or anything for them?
Not in the traditional sense of a reservation. In the States, you guys have got reservations, which were kind of like signed off areas that we'll send you to this place because of like treaties and that type of thing. We don't have a treaty in Australia. So for the most part, there are traditional lands, air quote, but it's not to the extent of reserves in America where they can kind of be self-governing and have their own police and everything. The government's still very heavily involved in what Indigenous people can and can't do. But in saying that, they do receive a lot of funding. Generally, there's anywhere between $24 to $30 billion a year is spent on Indigenous Australians to try and close the gap. And for listeners who don't know what that is, there's a gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, life expectancy, health, education, all sorts of metrics across the board where Indigenous people come out a lot lower than what non-Indigenous Australians do.
Okay, so are they pretty well integrated into y'all's society, or do they just kind of stick with their own people in their own areas? I mean, I'm not familiar with the geography of Australia. I'll be 100% honest. You might have to walk me through that a little more.
Yeah, so Australia is roughly the size of the United States, larger than Europe. So we have a massive, massive landmass that in itself, we have states that are larger than multiple European countries, larger than multiple US states combined. And if you go back far enough, the Indigenous nations that we hear, there's over 500 nations with 900 different languages in amongst that. So the variations in our First Nations people from one place to the other is astronomical, to the point where depending on what areas of Australia were settled first kind of dictates how integrated the First Nations people are. The east coast of Australia was colonised first, so New South Wales, Victoria, and they kind of moved out west a lot like in the United States. So the Indigenous people that are traditionally found in southeastern Australia, for the most part, and this can be a bit quite controversial, they're mixed peoples. They've got a lot of mixed ancestry, so it's not just Indigenous. They've got European, Scotch, Irish ancestry in along with them. A lot of my mates from the mobs around here, they tend to call other Aboriginals who are a lot lighter in skin tone milkies. They've got more milk in them than they do coffee. Apart from that, if you go up north and to Western Australia, you have the remote communities who are still holding corroborees and living their traditional lifestyles that really haven't changed for about 60,000 years. So there's a big difference between city Aboriginals and regional country Aboriginals, that's for sure.
I got you. Well, man, I'm unfortunately going to have to wrap this up. Looks like I've had a water line bust. Is there any way you can drop your plugs and kind of close this for me?
Yeah, sure. Drew Misson from Your Missing the Point podcast. You can find me on all the usual podcatchers. Misson is spelled Missen. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I'm search banned and shadow banned on Twitter and Instagram. So you might have to find me via a direct link, which maybe I can send to put in the show notes. But yeah, just find me in all the usual places.
For sure, man. I will have to have you back on if you'll come. I'd like to maybe talk about some of your experiences with lockdown during the craziness of 2020.
Sure, mate. Sounds good.
All right. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me on.